The rifle shot tore through the silent night air, sending Elizabeth North scrambling to gather what few possessions remained. Her husband William's body hadn't yet cooled in their burning homestead when she fled with 4-year-old Sarah clutched to her chest, the child's confused sobs muffled against her shoulder. Behind them, the Montana Territory's unforgiving autumn winds fanned the flames of what had once been their dream. The year was 1876, and the promise of a new life in the West had turned to ash. 3 days of desperate travel on foot had brought them to the outskirts of St. Joe. Elizabeth's dress was torn and mudded, her once neat auburn hair falling in tangles around her pale face. The barn loomed before them, its weathered wood offering the first shelter they'd seen since fleeing. "Just for tonight, sweet one," she whispered to Sarah, whose tiny face was pinched with cold and hunger. "Tomorrow we'll find something better." The barn smelled of hay and horses, and Elizabeth nearly wept at the simple comfort of being out of the wind. She made a small nest of straw in the corner farthest from the door, tucking her shawl around Sarah before curling her body protectively around her daughter. "Mama, I'm hungry," Sarah whispered. "I know, darling." "In the morning, we'll find food," Elizabeth promised, though the few coins sewn into the hem of her dress wouldn't last long. She hummed softly, an old lullaby her mother had sung, until Sarah's breathing deepened into sleep. Elizabeth remained awake, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and rustles of the barn. Her thoughts circled endlessly William's warnings about the land disputes, the masked men who'd broken down their door, the single shot that had silenced her husband forever. Tears slid silently down her face as exhaustion finally claimed her. She didn't hear the barn door open just before dawn. Ezekiel Carson rose with the sun every day of his life. At 32, the rhythm of ranch work was as natural to him as breathing. The morning ritual of checking his horses came first, even before coffee. He'd built his modest spread outside St. Joe through years of backbreaking work after returning from the war, and every animal, every fence post represented his determination to forge something lasting from wilderness. The strange tracks in the mud outside his barn made him pause. Smaller than a man's boot a woman's footprint, and beside it, an even smaller set. His hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his hip as he eased open the barn door. The gray light of dawn revealed them immediately, a woman and child huddled in the straw, both so still he thought for a terrible moment they might be dead. Then the woman's eyes flew open, wide with terror. She scrambled backward, pulling the small girl behind her. "Please," she gasped, "we meant no harm, we'll go now." Ezekiel kept his distance, hands raised slightly to show he wasn't reaching for his weapon. "Easy now, madam, I'm not going to hurt you." The woman's face was smudged with dirt, but couldn't hide her beauty or her youth. She couldn't be more than 25. The child peered fearfully around her mother's skirts. "We just needed shelter for the night," the woman explained, her voice steadier now but still wary. "We'll be on our way." Ezekiel noted the worn soles of their shoes, the tear in the woman's sleeve, the hungry look in the child's eyes. Something inside him, something he thought had died years ago on bloodied battlefields, stirred to life. "You'll do no such thing," he said firmly. "You'll sleep under my roof tonight." "Both of you?" The woman stiffened, suspicion clouding her features. "We don't need charity." "It isn't charity to offer shelter to those who need it," Ezekiel replied. "I've got a warm house, plenty of food, and no one to share it with. It'd be a sin to send you back into the cold." The little girl's stomach growled audibly and color touched the woman's cheeks. "I'm Ezekiel Carson. This is my ranch." After a long pause, she spoke. "Elizabeth North. This is my daughter, Sarah. Miss North, Mrs." she corrected quickly. "My husband, he's—" Her voice broke. "You don't need to explain," Ezekiel said gently. "Not now. Come to the house. There's breakfast to be made, and you both look like you could use it." Elizabeth hesitated, weighing fear against necessity. Sarah tugged at her skirt. "Mama, I'm hungry." With a sigh, Elizabeth nodded and gathered their meager belongings. "Just for breakfast," she said firmly. "Then we'll be on our way to town." The walk to the house was short but revealing. Ezekiel's ranch wasn't grand, but it spoke of care and hard work. A modest one-story home with a covered porch sat nestled against a backdrop of pine trees. A small vegetable garden, now harvested for the coming winter, lay to one side. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. Inside, the home was simple but comfortable. A cast iron stove dominated the kitchen, and Ezekiel quickly built up the fire. "Coffee will be ready soon," he said, moving with the efficiency of a man accustomed to caring for himself. Elizabeth stood awkwardly by the door, her daughter's hand clutched in hers until Ezekiel gestured to the wooden table. "Please sit, you're safe here." As the coffee brewed, Ezekiel fried bacon and eggs, sliced bread, and set out a jar of preserves. Sarah's eyes widened at the sight of so much food, and even Elizabeth couldn't hide her hunger. They ate in relative silence, Ezekiel careful not to press for information. When Sarah had cleared her plate and begun to look around the cabin with curiosity, Elizabeth finally spoke. "Our homestead was burned 3 days ago. My husband was killed." She stated it plainly, though her knuckles whitened around her coffee cup. "We've been walking since then. I thought we could find work in St. Joe." Ezekiel nodded, his face grave. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. North." "Was it raiders?" "Land disputes," she said bitterly. "The Blackwell Mining Company wants to expand. William refused to sell." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. He knew the Blackwell name well enough. "The law in St. Joe won't help you. Sheriff Dawson's in Blackwell's pocket." Fear flashed across Elizabeth's face. "Then we'll go farther. Helena, perhaps. It's nearly 100 miles to Helena, and winter's coming on fast." Ezekiel hesitated, then added, "I've got a proposition, Mrs. North. I need help around here. The house needs tending, and I could use an extra pair of hands for the lighter ranch work. There's a small cabin out back where my ranch hand used to stay before he moved on. It's yours if you want it." Elizabeth's spine straightened. "Mr. Carson, I don't know what kind of woman you think I am, a desperate one," he interrupted gently. "With a child to protect, I'm offering honest work for fair pay, nothing more." Their eyes met across the table, and Ezekiel felt something shift in the room. Elizabeth North was proud, despite her circumstances. He respected that. "Just until spring," she said finally. "By then I'll have saved enough to start somewhere new." Ezekiel nodded. "Spring it is." The cabin was small but sturdy, with a stone fireplace and a single room divided by a curtain. Ezekiel helped them settle in, bringing linens, firewood, and some of his late mother's clothing that had been packed away in trunks. "It ain't much," he said, looking around the sparse space, "but it'll keep you warm." Elizabeth ran her hands over the clean blankets. "It's more than we had yesterday. Thank you, Mr. Carson." "Ezekiel," he corrected. "If we're to be working together, might as well use my given name." "Ezekiel," she repeated softly. He cleared his throat. "I'll leave you to rest. Come to the main house for supper at sundown." As he walked back to his home, Ezekiel wondered at his own impulsiveness. He'd lived alone since returning from the war, finding peace in solitude, yet something about the fierce protectiveness in Elizabeth North's eyes had moved him. He told himself it was simple Christian charity, nothing more. Elizabeth watched him go, conflicting emotions churning inside her. Gratitude warred with wariness, relief with suspicion. But as Sarah explored their new shelter with growing excitement, Elizabeth allowed herself a small measure of hope. They were alive. They had shelter. For now, it would have to be enough. She had no way of knowing that this barn, this ranch, this taciturn cowboy would change the course of their lives forever. The first week passed in a blur of adjustment. Elizabeth woke before dawn each day to help with breakfast before Ezekiel headed out to tend the livestock. She spent her days cleaning the main house, mending clothes, and learning to cook on the unfamiliar stove. Sarah trailed behind her, gradually becoming less timid, occasionally venturing outside to watch Ezekiel work with the horses from a safe distance. At night, Elizabeth would lie awake in the cabin, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness and wondering if she'd made the right choice. Trusting a stranger went against everything William had taught her about survival. Yet Ezekiel had been nothing but respectful, keeping his distance while ensuring they had everything they needed. On the 8th day, a heavy snow began to fall. By midday, white flakes swirled so thickly that the main house was barely visible from the cabin. Ezekiel appeared at their door, arms laden with extra firewood. "Storm's coming in faster than expected," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Best stay inside until it passes." Elizabeth nodded, taking the wood from him. "Will the animals be all right? Just got them all in the barn. They'll weather it fine." He hesitated. "If you need anything, just call out. I'll hear you." The storm raged through the night and into the next day. Elizabeth kept the fire burning steadily, telling Sarah stories to distract her from the howling wind. When a particularly strong gust rattled the cabin windows, Sarah burst into tears. "I want Papa," she sobbed, and Elizabeth gathered her close, her own grief threatening to overwhelm her. "I know, sweetheart, I miss him too." A knock at the door startled them both. Ezekiel stood there, snow dusting his broad shoulders, holding a covered pot. "Thought you might like some stew," he said, his eyes shifting to Sarah's tear-streaked face. "And I brought something else." From inside his coat, he produced a small wooden horse, roughly carved but recognizable. "Made this last night, thought the little one might like it." Sarah approached cautiously, reaching for the toy. "Thank you," she whispered, examining the carving with growing interest. "You're welcome, Miss Sarah." Ezekiel's normally stern expression softened as he watched her. "My pa made me one just like it when I was about your age." It was the first personal detail he'd shared, and Elizabeth found herself curious about the man who had taken them in. "Would you like to stay for supper? It seems only fair since you brought it." Surprise flickered across his features before he nodded. "I'd be obliged." That evening marked a turning point. As they ate together in the small cabin, Ezekiel gradually opened up about his life growing up on a farm in Missouri, fighting for the Union in the war, coming west afterward to escape memories too painful to revisit. Elizabeth shared stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, meeting William at a harvest dance, their decision to seek a new beginning in Montana. "William was a dreamer," she said, a sad smile touching her lips. "He saw possibility everywhere. I was more practical, but he convinced me the West was our future." Ezekiel nodded. "Takes dreams to come out here, but practicality to survive. We were managing well enough until Blackwell's men came." Her voice hardened. "3 of them with masks. They gave William one last chance to sell. When he refused, She glanced at Sarah, now playing contentedly with her wooden horse, and left the sentence unfinished. "Blackwell controls most of the territory around St. Joe," Ezekiel said grimly. "Owns the bank, the mining operations, half the businesses in town. Men like that think they're entitled to whatever they want. Have you had trouble with him?" Ezekiel's face darkened. "My land's not valuable to him yet, but I've seen what happens to those who stand in his way." The storm kept them confined for 3 days. Each evening, Ezekiel returned to the cabin with supplies and stayed for supper. Elizabeth found herself looking forward to these visits, to the quiet conversation and the way Sarah was gradually warming to him, proudly showing him how she'd named her wooden horse Chestnut. On the 4th day, the sky cleared. Elizabeth opened the cabin door to find the world transformed into a glittering white expanse. Sarah squealed with delight, rushing out to touch the snow that reached past her knees. Ezekiel appeared from the direction of the barn, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Thought we might head into town today if you're up for it. Need supplies, and you might want to see St. Joe for yourself." The suggestion sent a ripple of anxiety through Elizabeth. "What if someone recognizes me, if Blackwell's men are there? We'll say you're my cousin, come to help after my mother's passing," Ezekiel said. "No one would connect you to a homesteader's widow from 40 miles north." The plan made sense, yet Elizabeth hesitated. The ranch had become a haven, a place where she felt secure for the first time since William's death. Venturing into town meant facing the wider world again. "I should go," she said finally. "We need winter clothes for Sarah." They set out an hour later in Ezekiel's wagon, Sarah nestled between them under thick blankets. The journey took longer than usual with the snow-covered roads, but by midday, the small settlement of St. Joe came into view. Elizabeth had expected something larger. A single main street lined with wooden buildings comprised most of the town: a general store, a saloon, a small church, and various businesses. At the far end stood a more imposing structure, the Blackwell Mining Company offices. "Not much to look at," Ezekiel said, noting her expression, but it serves the ranches and homesteads for 20 miles around. They stopped first at the general store. Elizabeth kept her head down, thankful for the heavy shawl that partially obscured her face. The storekeeper, a jovial man named Harrison, greeted Ezekiel warmly. "Carson thought the snow might have buried you out there. Takes more than a storm to keep me down," Ezekiel replied, helping Elizabeth and Sarah down from the wagon. "My cousin and her daughter are staying with me for a while." "Mrs. North, this is Henry Harrison." Elizabeth nodded politely, relieved when the shopkeeper showed no particular interest in her story. Sarah clung to her skirts, wide-eyed at the store's offerings, barrels of flour and sugar, shelves of canned goods, tools, fabric, and various sundries. While Ezekiel arranged for feed and supplies to be loaded into the wagon, Elizabeth selected fabric for winter clothing and a few simple toys for Sarah. She was examining a bolt of wool when the store door opened, bringing with it a blast of cold air and 3 well-dressed men. "Harrison." "My usual order," the leader called out. Tall and imposing with a silver-streaked beard, he carried himself with the confidence of wealth and power. The 2 younger men flanking him surveyed the store with entitled disinterest. Elizabeth turned away quickly, her heart pounding. Though she'd never seen him before, she knew instinctively who had entered James Blackwell himself, the man responsible for William's death. Ezekiel moved subtly closer to her, his body partially blocking her from view. "We're almost finished here," he said quietly. Blackwell noticed them anyway. "Carson," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "Didn't expect to see you in town so soon after the storm." "Mr. Blackwell," Ezekiel replied, his tone neutral but his posture tense. "Just restocking supplies." Blackwell's gaze shifted to Elizabeth, who kept her face averted. "Don't believe I've had the pleasure, my cousin," Ezekiel said before Elizabeth could speak. Visiting from back east, something in Blackwell's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but he merely smiled. "Welcome to St. Joe, Mrs. North," Elizabeth said, forcing herself to meet his eyes steadily. "Thank you." For a moment, she feared recognition might flicker in his gaze, but he simply nodded and turned his attention back to Harrison. Elizabeth released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They completed their purchases quickly and left, Ezekiel helping Elizabeth and Sarah into the wagon with more haste than was strictly necessary. As they pulled away from the hitching post, Elizabeth glanced back to find Blackwell watching them from the store window. "He knows," she whispered. "He suspects," Ezekiel corrected, "but he can't be certain. There are plenty of widows named North." They made one more stop at the small church, where Ezekiel introduced Elizabeth to Father Thomas, an elderly priest with kind eyes and a gentle manner. "Any friend of Ezekiel's is welcome here," he said, smiling at Sarah, who had relaxed enough to explore the simple chapel. "We've not seen him bring visitors in quite some time." Elizabeth noticed a faint color touch Ezekiel's cheeks at this observation. "Father Thomas has been in St. Joe since before it had a name," Ezekiel explained. "Knows more about this territory than anyone, including which men might burn a family out of their home." Elizabeth asked quietly when Sarah had wandered out of earshot. The priest's expression grew somber. "You're the North widow, aren't you? Word reached us of the homestead burning north of here. I prayed for your souls, fearing the worst." "Only my husband's soul needs your prayers now, Father." Thomas nodded sadly. "Blackwell's reach grows longer each month. The law won't touch him, he owns too many pockets." "We're not seeking justice," Ezekiel interjected, "just safety." "Then you've found the right place," Thomas said, looking between them with thoughtful eyes. "Ezekiel's ranch is one of the few properties Blackwell hasn't tried to acquire." "Yet," Ezekiel added grimly. They left town before sunset, the wagon loaded with supplies. Elizabeth sat silently beside Ezekiel, her thoughts troubled. Seeing Blackwell in the flesh, this ordinary-looking man who had ordered her husband's murder, made everything painfully real again. "I've put you at risk," she said finally. "If Blackwell connects me to the homestead." "He won't," Ezekiel assured her. "And even if he did, my land's protected. My father was one of the original settlers here, fought alongside the territorial governor in the war, my deeds as solid as they come." Elizabeth wasn't convinced, but the quiet confidence in his voice was reassuring. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. Ezekiel's hands tightened on the reins. No need for thanks. Any decent man would do the same. But as they continued their journey home through the gathering dusk, Elizabeth wondered if that was true. Decent men were rare enough in the territories, and those willing to risk Blackwell's enmity were rarer still. She glanced at Ezekiel's profile, strong and steady against the fading light, and felt something stir within her that she hadn't expected, a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the man himself. The weeks leading up to Christmas transformed the ranch in ways Ezekiel hadn't anticipated. The house, once merely functional, became a home under Elizabeth's care. Fresh curtains appeared at windows, the scent of baking bread filled the kitchen, and Sarah's laughter echoed through rooms that had known only silence for years. Elizabeth proved herself invaluable beyond household matters. She had a natural affinity for the chickens and dairy cow, took over their care entirely, and showed a keen mind for accounts when Ezekiel mentioned struggling with the ledgers. "My father was a bookkeeper," she explained one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, the leather-bound ledger open between them. "He taught me his methods." Ezekiel watched her neat figures fill the page, her brow furrowed in concentration, a strand of auburn hair falling across her cheek. He fought the urge to brush it back, instead clearing his throat and rising to stoke the fire. These moments of awareness were coming more frequently, noticing the graceful way she moved, the dimple that appeared when she truly smiled, how her eyes changed from hazel to green depending on the light. Ezekiel chided himself for such observations. Elizabeth was his employee, a widow still grieving, a woman who needed his protection, not his admiration, yet he couldn't help but notice she seemed more at ease in his presence too. Her smiles came more readily, and sometimes he would catch her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. As Christmas approached, Sarah grew increasingly excited. Elizabeth warned Ezekiel that the holiday might be difficult there first without William, but the child's enthusiasm was contagious. "We should cut a tree," Ezekiel suggested one morning at breakfast. "There's a stand of pines on the north pasture that could spare one." Sarah clapped her hands delightedly. "Can we decorate it? Mama knows how to make paper chains. I think we can manage that." Elizabeth smiled, though Ezekiel noted the hint of sadness in her eyes. "Perhaps Mr. Carson has some ornaments packed away." He shook his head. "Haven't celebrated proper since before the war, but I'm sure we can fashion something suitable." That afternoon, they bundled up against the cold and rode out to select a tree. Sarah, perched in front of Ezekiel on his horse, pointed excitedly at every pine they passed until they found one the perfect size. As Ezekiel chopped it down, Elizabeth and Sarah gathered pine cones to use as decorations. The simple outing felt profoundly meaningful to Ezekiel. It had been so long since he'd shared such ordinary joys with anyone. Watching Elizabeth show Sarah how to identify animal tracks in the snow, hearing their laughter ring out across the white landscape, he realized how solitary his existence had been and how much richer it felt now. Back at the ranch, they set up the tree in the main house. Elizabeth produced colored paper she'd purchased in town and taught both Sarah and Ezekiel how to cut strips for chains. Ezekiel contributed red berries he'd collected and some bits of metal and colored glass that caught the light. By evening, the tree stood transformed, a homemade star fashioned from tin perched atop it. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth said softly, standing back to admire their work. The firelight cast a warm glow over the room, reflecting off the makeshift ornaments. "Best Christmas tree I've ever seen," Ezekiel agreed, though his eyes were not on the pine but on Elizabeth's face, radiant in the golden light. That night, after Sarah had been tucked into bed in the cabin, Elizabeth returned to the main house to help with some mending. They sat comfortably by the fire, the only sounds the crackling of logs and the soft snip of her scissors. "I've been thinking," Ezekiel said finally, setting aside the bridle he'd been repairing. "The cabin's drafty, especially on the north side. You and Sarah might be more comfortable in the house until spring." Elizabeth looked up, needle poised mid-stitch. "In the house, I could take the cabin," he continued quickly. "There's more room here for the both of you." "That's very generous, but I couldn't put you out of your home." It's hardly putting me out when it was my suggestion, Ezekiel said. Besides, I spent 4 years of the war sleeping on the ground. The cabin's a palace compared. Elizabeth considered this, her eyes moving to the Christmas tree. It would be nice for Sarah to have Christmas morning in a proper house, she admitted. But only if you're certain. I am. The next day, they moved their few belongings into the house. Ezekiel had cleared space in the second bedroom, which had served mainly for storage since his mother's death. Seeing Elizabeth and Sarah settling into his home stirred complex emotions, satisfaction at providing for them, pleasure at their presence, and a deeper longing he dared not examine too closely. Christmas Eve arrived with a fresh blanket of snow. After supper, Ezekiel surprised Sarah with a small wooden sled he'd crafted in the barn during odd hours. "For me," she gasped, running her hands over the smooth runners. "Every child needs a sled," Ezekiel said, smiling as she threw her arms around his legs in thanks. Later, when Sarah had gone to bed full of anticipation for Christmas morning, Elizabeth presented Ezekiel with her own gift, a new wool scarf she'd knitted from yarn purchased in town. "It's not much," she said as he unwrapped it, "but I noticed yours was threadbare." Ezekiel ran his fingers over the careful stitches, deeply moved by the simple present. "It's perfect," he said thickly. "I have something for you too." He retrieved a small package from his coat pocket and handed it to her. Inside was a silver locket on a delicate chain. "It was my mother's," he explained as Elizabeth opened it to find it empty. "Thought you might want to put a lock of Sarah's hair inside to keep close." Elizabeth closed her fingers around the locket, tears brightening her eyes. "Ezekiel, I can't accept this. It's too precious." "It's been sitting in a drawer for years," he said gently. "My mother would have wanted a woman like you to have it. A woman like me, strong, kind, devoted to her child." He hesitated, then added softly, "Beautiful." The word hung between them, changing the air in the room. Elizabeth's cheeks flushed, and Ezekiel feared he'd overstepped. But she didn't look away. "Thank you," she whispered, and then, before he could react, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. Ezekiel stood frozen, the warmth of her lips lingering on his skin as she stepped back. For a moment, neither spoke, the crackling fire the only sound in the room. "I should check on Sarah," Elizabeth said finally, her voice unsteady. "Good night, Ezekiel." "Good night," he echoed, watching her disappear down the hallway, the locket clutched in her hand. That night, lying in the cabin that still held Elizabeth's scent in the linens, Ezekiel acknowledged what he'd been denying for weeks. He was falling in love with Elizabeth North. The realization both elated and terrified him. She was still mourning her husband, still planning to leave in the spring. Opening his heart to her meant risking its breaking when she inevitably moved on. Yet, as he drifted towards sleep, the memory of her kiss warming him more than the fire, Ezekiel knew it was already too late to protect himself. His heart had made its choice without consulting his better judgment. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear. Ezekiel arrived at the house early, arms laden with firewood, to find Sarah already awake and bursting with excitement. Elizabeth stood in the kitchen, her hair loose around her shoulders, wearing one of his mother's old dresses that she'd altered to fit her slighter frame. The sight of her, domestic and at ease in his home, made his chest tighten with longing. The day passed in a blur of simple pleasures. They exchanged modest gifts, carved animals for Sarah, practical items for the adults, and special treats Elizabeth had baked. After dinner, Ezekiel took Sarah sledding on a gentle slope behind the house, her delighted squeals carrying on the crisp air. Elizabeth watched from the porch, wrapped in a shawl, her smile warmer than any fire. That evening, when Sarah had finally surrendered to sleep, exhausted from the day's excitement, Ezekiel and Elizabeth sat before the fire sharing a pot of coffee. "This has been the most wonderful Christmas," Elizabeth said, gazing into the flames. "I didn't think it would be possible to feel joy again so soon after." She trailed off, the unspoken name of her husband hanging in the air. "Grief and joy can exist together," Ezekiel said quietly. "Took me years to learn that. After losing my parents after the war, I thought happiness was something for other folks." Elizabeth turned to face him, her expression open and curious. "What changed?" Ezekiel met her eyes steadily. "You did," he said simply. "You and Sarah." The honesty of his words hung between them, too significant to be misinterpreted. Elizabeth's lips parted in surprise, but she didn't look away. Ezekiel, a sudden pounding on the door shattered the moment. Ezekiel rose quickly, hand moving automatically to the pistol he kept on the mantel. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice instantly hard. He opened the door to find Father Thomas on his porch, snow dusting his coat, his aged face lined with urgency. "Father, what brings you out on Christmas night, danger?" the priest said breathlessly. "May I come in?" Ezekiel ushered him inside. Elizabeth had risen from her chair, alarm evident in her posture. "Mrs. North," Father Thomas acknowledged, "I feared I might be too late." "Too late for what?" Ezekiel demanded. "Blackwell knows who you are," the priest said, addressing Elizabeth directly. "One of his men recognized you in town. They plan to come for you tomorrow to silence you before you can make any claims against Blackwell for your husband's murder." Elizabeth's face drained of color. "How do you know this?" "Blackwell's foreman gets loose-lipped when he drinks. He was in the saloon tonight, boasting to one of the working girls who attends my Sunday services. She came straight to me." Ezekiel's mind raced. "How many men?" "5, maybe 6. They plan to make it look like a robbery gone wrong." Elizabeth sank back into her chair. "Sarah," she whispered. "I have to get her away from here." "There's no time," Father Thomas said grimly. "The roads are watched. Your best chance is to stay put and prepare." Ezekiel paced the room, calculating options. "I've got rifles, ammunition. The house is defensible." "You can't fight Blackwell's entire operation," Elizabeth protested. "This is my battle, not yours." Ezekiel turned to her, his expression fierce. "It became my battle the moment you stepped onto my land. I won't let them harm you or Sarah." The intensity in his voice silenced her objections. Father Thomas looked between them with understanding in his aged eyes. "There may be another way," he said slowly, "one that would offer Mrs. North protection beyond what guns can provide." "What do you mean?" Elizabeth asked. The priest hesitated. "Blackwell's men are coming for a widow with no legal standing, no connections in the territory. But a married woman, the wife of a respected rancher with deep ties to the community, that would be a different matter entirely." Ezekiel stared at the priest, understanding dawning. "You're suggesting marriage," Father Thomas finished. "Immediately, tonight," Elizabeth gasped. "That's absurd, we barely know each other." "Sometimes God's path is revealed in unexpected ways," the priest said gently. "I've watched you both these past weeks. There are worse foundations for a marriage than mutual respect and shared danger." Ezekiel looked at Elizabeth, his heart pounding. This was madness, proposing marriage as a tactical decision. Yet beneath the practical considerations lay emotions he'd been trying to deny for weeks. "It would be a marriage in name only," he said quietly, "until the danger passes. Then, if you wish to leave in the spring, I wouldn't stop you." Elizabeth's eyes searched his, looking for something only she could name. "You would do this. Bind yourself legally to a woman you barely know, take on her troubles, her child." "I would." Father Thomas cleared his throat. "I'll step outside to give you a moment to discuss this privately." When the door closed behind him, silence filled the room. Ezekiel remained standing, giving Elizabeth the space to consider what had been proposed. "It's not how I imagined being asked again," she finally said, a tremulous smile touching her lips. "It's not how I imagined asking," Ezekiel admitted. He moved closer, kneeling beside her chair to meet her eyes. "But that doesn't mean it couldn't become real in time." Elizabeth's hand trembled as she reached out to touch his face, her fingers light against his beard. "You're a good man, Ezekiel Carson." "I'm just a man, Elizabeth. One who wants to protect you and Sarah." "Is that all you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ezekiel covered her hand with his own, turning to press a kiss to her palm. "No," he said honestly, "but that's all I'd ask for now." Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. "Then yes, I'll marry you tonight." The ceremony was simple and solemn. Father Thomas performed the rites by firelight, with only the sleeping Sarah as witness. Elizabeth wore the dress she had on, adorned with the silver locket Ezekiel had given her. Ezekiel had no ring to offer, but promised to provide one when they next went to town. "By the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife," Father Thomas concluded, genuine emotion in his voice despite the unusual circumstances. May God bless this union, however it began. Ezekiel looked down at Elizabeth, his wife, and felt a surge of protective determination. Whatever came tomorrow, she was his to defend now, legally and morally. When Father Thomas had departed, promising to spread word of the marriage immediately to ensure it reached Blackwell's ears, they stood awkwardly in the main room, the weight of what they'd done settling around them. "You should take the bedroom," Ezekiel said. "I'll sleep out here." Elizabeth nodded, relief evident in her posture. "Thank you for everything." "No need for thanks between husband and wife," Ezekiel said, testing the words. A faint blush colored Elizabeth's cheeks. "Husband," she echoed softly. "Good night, then, husband." She disappeared into the bedroom, leaving Ezekiel to contemplate how thoroughly his solitary life had been upended in the span of a single month, and how strangely right it felt, despite the danger that loomed with the dawn. Morning arrived with no sign of Blackwell's men. Ezekiel had slept little, keeping watch with a rifle across his knees, startling at every creak of the settling house. Elizabeth emerged from the bedroom just after sunrise, her face drawn from her own restless night. "Nothing," she asked quietly, careful not to wake Sarah. Ezekiel shook his head. "Maybe Father Thomas's plan worked, or maybe they're waiting for us to lower our guard." The day passed in tense vigilance. Ezekiel tended the animals quickly, keeping the house in sight. Elizabeth kept Sarah inside, inventing games to distract her from their unusual confinement. By nightfall, with still no sign of trouble, they began to hope Father Thomas's strategy had succeeded. A week passed this way, then another. January settled over the ranch with bitter cold and howling winds. The immediate threat seemed to have receded, though Ezekiel maintained his watchfulness whenever they ventured beyond the house. Gradually, they established a routine as husband and wife, though Ezekiel continued to sleep on a pallet in the main room. They shared meals, work, and increasingly comfortable conversation, but both carefully avoided any mention of the physical aspect of marriage. One evening, as a particularly fierce storm rattled the windows, Ezekiel found Elizabeth standing before the fireplace, staring into the flames. "Sarah's finally asleep," she said as he approached. "The storm frightened her." "She's safe here," Ezekiel assured her. "We all are." Elizabeth turned to face him, the firelight casting golden shadows across her features. "I've been thinking about spring," she said. Ezekiel's heart sank. Despite their marriage, she still planned to leave when the weather improved. He'd known this was the agreement, yet in the weeks since their hasty wedding, he'd begun to hope for more. "Where will you go?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. "That's just it," Elizabeth said softly. "I've been trying to decide, and I keep coming to the same conclusion." She took a step closer to him. "I don't want to go anywhere." Ezekiel stared at her, afraid to misunderstand. "What are you saying, Elizabeth?" "I'm saying that this arrangement, this marriage, it doesn't feel like just an arrangement anymore." Her eyes met his, vulnerable but direct. "Not to me." Ezekiel's pulse quickened. "It never was just an arrangement to me," he admitted. "Even from the beginning, from the barn." She asked, a small smile touching her lips. "Maybe even then," he said, reaching out tentatively to take her hand. "I looked at you and Sarah and felt something I hadn't felt in years, the need to protect someone, to care for them, to matter to someone else." Elizabeth's fingers tightened around his. "You matter, Ezekiel, more than I ever expected." He drew her gently closer, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she came willingly into his arms, he enfolded her against his chest, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the rightness of her body against his. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Elizabeth whispered against his shirt. "After William died, I thought that part of me had died too. But you," she looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, "you've brought it back to life." Ezekiel cupped her face in his hands, overwhelmed by the surge of emotion her words evoked. "Elizabeth," he murmured, "I love you. I think I've loved you since that first night by the fire when you were mending my shirt and humming to yourself, not even realizing you were doing it." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she was smiling. "I love you too." It happened so gradually I didn't recognize it until it was already there, filling all the broken places inside me. Ezekiel lowered his head slowly, giving her time to draw back if she wished. Instead, she rose to meet him, her lips touching his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened with shared hunger. Her arms wound around his neck as his hands splayed across her back, drawing her closer until every inch of her was pressed against him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Ezekiel rested his forehead against hers. "I'll be a good husband to you, Elizabeth, a father to Sarah, I swear it." "I know," she whispered, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "You already are." She took his hand then, and with a certainty that left no room for doubt, led him toward the bedroom that had, until now, been hers alone. The pre-dawn light filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the bed where Elizabeth lay curled against Ezekiel's side. His arm encircled her protectively, even in sleep, and she marveled at how natural it felt to wake beside him. The night had transformed their marriage from legal convenience to something deep and irrevocable. Elizabeth traced her finger lightly over his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. The guilt she'd expected to feel betraying William's memory was absent. Instead, there was only a profound sense of rightness, as though her life had somehow found its proper course again. Ezekiel stirred, his eyes opening to find her watching him. A slow smile spread across his face. "Good morning, Mrs. Carson." The name, spoken in his sleep-roughened voice, sent a pleasant shiver through her. "Good morning, husband," she replied, leaning up to press a kiss to his lips. His arms tightened around her, deepening the kiss until a small voice from the doorway interrupted them. "Mama, Mr. Ezekiel." They broke apart to find Sarah standing uncertainly in the doorway, clutching her wooden horse. Elizabeth quickly pulled the blankets higher, while Ezekiel sat up against the headboard. "Come here, sweetheart," Elizabeth called, opening her arms. Sarah approached cautiously, her eyes moving between them. "Why is Mr. Ezekiel in your bed?" Elizabeth exchanged a glance with Ezekiel, who nodded encouragingly. "Well, Sarah, Mr. Ezekiel isn't just Mr. Ezekiel anymore. He's—" She hesitated, then continued firmly. "He's your new papa now, we're a family." Sarah's brow furrowed as she processed this information. "But what about my real papa?" "Your real papa will always be your papa in heaven," Elizabeth said gently. "No one can ever replace him in your heart, but Ezekiel loves us very much and he wants to take care of us forever." Sarah turned her solemn gaze to Ezekiel. "Do you promise?" Ezekiel nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise, Sarah. I'll be the best papa I can be if you'll let me." After a long moment of consideration, Sarah climbed onto the bed and settled between them. "Can I still keep Chestnut?" she asked, holding up the wooden horse. Ezekiel laughed, the tension broken. "Of course you can. In fact, I was thinking we might get you a real pony when spring comes." Sarah's eyes widened with delight. "A real pony, really? Really?" Elizabeth confirmed, sharing a smile with Ezekiel over their daughter's head, their daughter. The thought filled her with quiet joy. They were a family now, unexpected, unplanned, but no less real for how it had come about. The peaceful moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Ezekiel was out of bed instantly, reaching for his clothes. "Stay here," he ordered, striding to the window and cautiously peering out. His shoulders tensed at what he saw. "Riders, 5 of them." Elizabeth clutched Sarah closer. "Blackwell's men, can't tell yet." Ezekiel pulled on his boots and reached for the rifle he kept by the bed. "Get dressed quickly. If trouble starts, take Sarah out the back and head for the root cellar. I'll hold them off." Fear gripped Elizabeth's heart as she hurried to dress herself and Sarah. The happiness they'd just discovered couldn't be snatched away so cruelly. She wouldn't allow it. By the time they were clothed, Ezekiel had positioned himself by the front window, rifle at the ready. Elizabeth stationed Sarah in the kitchen with strict instructions to stay put, then joined Ezekiel. "It's Blackwell himself," Ezekiel said grimly, nodding toward the lead rider, "and his foreman. The others look like hired guns." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "What do they want?" "Father Thomas spread word of our marriage weeks ago. We're about to find out." The riders drew up before the house, spreading out in a semicircle that allowed no easy escape. James Blackwell dismounted first, his expensive coat and polished boots incongruous against the muddy ranch yard. "Carson," he called out, "I know you're in there, just want to talk." Ezekiel and Elizabeth exchanged a glance. "Stay back from the windows," he whispered. "I'm going out." Ezekiel, no, if I don't, they'll come in. Better to face them on our terms. He touched her cheek briefly. I love you, remember that, whatever happens. Before she could protest further, he moved to the door, rifle still in hand but pointed downward in a gesture that was cautious rather than overtly threatening. Blackwell, he acknowledged from the porch. Early for social calls. The mining magnate smiled thinly. This isn't social, Carson. I've come about the woman you're harboring. You mean my wife? Ezekiel's voice carried clearly in the still morning air. Wife, is it? Blackwell chuckled. Convenient timing, that marriage, almost as if you were trying to shield her from something. I married her because I love her, Ezekiel said firmly. Her past is her own business. Blackwell's smile faded. Her past becomes my business when it involves making accusations against me. The widow North has been spreading lies about my company's involvement in her husband's unfortunate accident. From inside the house, Elizabeth watched through a crack in the curtains, her hands trembling with rage. Accident? William had been murdered in cold blood, their home burned to the ground. My wife hasn't made any accusations, Ezekiel said, his stance relaxed but alert. We've been too busy building our life here to concern ourselves with yours. Blackwell studied him for a long moment. Let me speak plainly, Carson. I don't care who you've married or why, but if Mrs. North or Mrs. Carson, as she now calls herself, ever testifies about what she thinks she saw that night, it would be problematic. Are you threatening my family? Ezekiel's voice had hardened dangerously. I'm offering you a business proposition, Blackwell replied smoothly. $5,000 for your ranch, enough to take your new family and start fresh somewhere far from Montana territory. California, perhaps, or Oregon. Elizabeth's breath caught. It was an enormous sum, far more than the ranch was worth. Ezekiel didn't hesitate, not interested. Blackwell's expression darkened. Don't be a fool, Carson. No piece of land is worth dying for. Maybe not, Ezekiel agreed, but family is, and this land is part of what I'm building for mine. The standoff stretched, tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. Elizabeth's heart pounded so loudly she was certain they could hear it outside. If bullets started flying, Ezekiel was outnumbered 5-1. She couldn't let him face this alone. Decision made, she moved to the door and stepped out onto the porch beside him, ignoring his warning glance. Mr. Blackwell, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I believe we met briefly in Harrison's store. Blackwell's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Carson, how convenient that you've joined us. I want to be clear about something, Elizabeth continued, standing tall beside her husband. I have no interest in the past. My first husband, is gone and nothing will bring him back. What I care about now is my future here with Ezekiel and my daughter. A very touching sentiment, Blackwell said dryly, but forgive me if I find it difficult to believe. Believe what you like, Elizabeth replied, but know this: as long as you leave us in peace, we'll have no quarrel with you. The past stays buried. She felt Ezekiel's surprise at her words but kept her gaze fixed on Blackwell. It wasn't surrendering, not exactly. It was choosing a different kind of justice, the justice of building a good life despite what Blackwell had taken from her. Blackwell considered her for a long moment. And if I don't trust your word, then trust this, Ezekiel interjected. If anything happens to my family, anything at all, I'll hold you personally responsible, and I won't be coming for your hired men. His meaning was unmistakable. The mining magnate's jaw tightened, but Elizabeth could see calculation in his eyes. Blackwell hadn't built his empire by taking unnecessary risks. A direct confrontation with Ezekiel Carson, especially now that Elizabeth's testimony was their only evidence against him, offered more dangers than rewards. Very well, Blackwell said finally. Keep your ranch, Carson, and your wife. But remember, this territory is growing. Progress can't be stopped. Someday you'll find yourself surrounded by my operations, and this accommodation may need to be revisited. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Ezekiel replied evenly. Good day, Blackwell. With a curt nod, Blackwell remounted his horse. Good day, Mr. and Mrs. Carson. Enjoy your happiness. They watched in tense silence as the riders departed, waiting until they were mere specks in the distance before allowing themselves to breathe normally again. Did you mean what you said? Ezekiel asked quietly. About letting the past stay buried, Elizabeth turned to face him, seeing the concern in his eyes. William is gone, she said softly. Nothing will bring him back, not revenge, not justice through the courts. What matters now is protecting what we have. She reached for his hand. And what we have is worth protecting, Ezekiel. He drew her into his arms, holding her tightly against him. I would have fought for you, for us. I know, she whispered against his chest. That's why I couldn't let you. Some battles aren't worth the cost of winning. Sarah appeared in the doorway, uncertainty written across her small face. Are the bad men gone? Mama, Elizabeth and Ezekiel exchanged a glance before Ezekiel knelt to Sarah's level. Yes, little one, the bad men are gone and they won't be coming back. Promise. Promise, he assured her, opening his arms. Sarah came to him without hesitation, allowing herself to be lifted and held secure between them. We're safe now, all of us. As they stood together on the porch, the rising sun casting long shadows across the ranch that was now truly their home, Elizabeth felt a sense of rightness settle over her. The path that had led her here had been marked by unimaginable loss, but it had also brought her to this moment, to this man who loved her with such fierce protection, to this second chance at family and happiness. The winter yielded gradually to spring. The snows melted, revealing tender green shoots beneath. The cattle were moved to higher pastures, and Ezekiel, true to his word, brought home a gentle pony for Sarah. Elizabeth watched her daughter's confidence grow as she learned to ride, Ezekiel's patient hands guiding both child and animal. Their marriage deepened with each passing day. The passion they'd discovered in each other that first night never waned, but it was matched by growing partnership in all aspects of life. Elizabeth's skills with figures and organization complemented Ezekiel's practical knowledge of ranching, and together they began to expand their operations, adding more cattle and planning improvements to the house. Word had spread throughout the territory about Blackwell's confrontation with the Carsons and how the mining magnate had backed down. The story, embellished with each telling, had elevated Ezekiel's status among the other ranchers and settlers. More importantly, it seemed to have established a fragile peace with Blackwell, who made no further attempts to approach them. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, Elizabeth placed Ezekiel's hand over her stomach. I have something to tell you, she said softly. He looked at her questioningly, then understanding dawned in his eyes. Are you certain? Elizabeth nodded, her heart full at the wonder spreading across his face. Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. By Christmas, there will be another Carson in this house. Ezekiel gathered her into his arms, his joy too profound for words. Elizabeth held him tightly, marveling at how life circled back upon itself, how a desperate night in a stranger's barn could lead, improbably, to this moment of perfect happiness. I never thought I'd have this, Ezekiel murmured against her hair. A wife, children, a true family. I'd resigned myself to being alone. So had I, Elizabeth admitted. After William died, I couldn't imagine loving again. I was just trying to survive. She drew back to look into his eyes. But then you found us in your barn and said those words. You'll sleep under my roof, Ezekiel recalled, smiling at the memory. Little did I know it would become my roof too, Elizabeth said, leaning up to kiss him as the last rays of sunlight gilded their entwined figures. Inside the house, Sarah played with her wooden horse, blissfully unaware of the news that would soon change her world again. On the hillside beyond, spring flowers dotted the green pastures where the Carson herd grazed peacefully. And in the distance, the mountains stood as they always had, silent witnesses to the resilience of love in a land as harsh as it was beautiful. The summer and fall passed in a whirl of preparation and anticipation. Elizabeth's body changed, the curve of her belly growing more pronounced with each passing month. Ezekiel watched these changes with a mixture of wonder and protective concern, often finding excuses to take over her more strenuous tasks despite her protests that pregnancy wasn't an illness. I'm perfectly capable of gathering eggs, she would insist as he gently steered her back toward the house. I know you are, Ezekiel would reply, dropping a kiss on her forehead, but it pleases me to do it for you. "Let me have this, Elizabeth." She would relent, secretly touched by his solicitude. It was so different from her first pregnancy with William, when necessity had demanded she work until the day Sarah was born. This time, she had the luxury of rest when she needed it, of a husband who anticipated her needs before she voiced them. Sarah approached the idea of a sibling with cautious enthusiasm, peppering them with questions about the baby and where it would sleep. Ezekiel spent the fall building a proper crib, carving intricate designs of forest animals along its rails. Elizabeth sewed tiny garments in the evenings, her needle flying as she and Ezekiel talked about names and plans for the future. They decided to expand the house in the spring, adding another bedroom and enlarging the kitchen. The ranch was prospering, with the cattle herd nearly doubled, and a small but growing reputation for quality stock. Ezekiel had even hired 2 permanent hands to help with the increased workload, building separate quarters for them near the barn. As winter approached once more, they made a trip into St. Joe for supplies and Elizabeth's regular checkup with Dr. Miller. The town had changed subtly since their confrontation with Blackwell. New businesses had opened, including a competitor to Blackwell's general store. There were whispers that the territorial governor was investigating some of Blackwell's more questionable business practices. "Times are changing," Father Thomas remarked when they stopped to visit him at the church. "Men like Blackwell still hold power, but it's not absolute anymore. The territory's growing up. As long as he leaves us in peace, that's all I care about," Ezekiel said, his arm protectively around Elizabeth's shoulders. The priest smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the best revenge is living well, and from what I can see, you two are doing exactly that." They returned to the ranch laden with supplies for the winter and the coming birth. Dr. Miller had promised to ride out when Elizabeth's time came, weather permitting, but they prepared for every contingency. The previous midwife in the area had moved on, but one of their neighbors' wives, Mrs. Thornton, had helped deliver many babies and agreed to assist if needed. December arrived with gentle snows rather than the fierce blizzards of the previous year. On Christmas Eve, almost exactly a year since their hasty marriage, Ezekiel and Elizabeth sat before the fire in their expanded living room. Sarah had gone to bed early, having extracted promises that she would be woken the moment her new sibling showed signs of arriving. "A year," Elizabeth mused, her hands resting on her prominent belly where the baby kicked vigorously. "It feels both longer and shorter somehow." Ezekiel took her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Best year of my life, without question, even with Blackwell's threats, the worry." "The expansion of the ranch," Elizabeth teased. "All of it," Ezekiel confirmed seriously. "Every moment with you and Sarah has been a gift I never expected to receive." Elizabeth leaned against him, content in a way she'd never imagined possible after the tragedy that had brought her to his door. "Do you ever think about how unlikely it all is? If I hadn't chosen your barn that night—" "Providence," Ezekiel said simply. "Some things are meant to be despite all odds." Their peaceful reflection was interrupted by a sharp intake of breath from Elizabeth as she straightened suddenly. "What is it?" Ezekiel asked, instantly alert. "I think," Elizabeth said with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, "that our child might be arriving somewhat earlier than expected." The next 12 hours passed in a blur of activity. Mrs. Thornton was summoned from the neighboring ranch, arriving just as Elizabeth's labor intensified. Sarah was settled with Ezekiel in the main room, helping him prepare coffee and food for the birthing attendants while trying to distract herself from her mother's occasional cries. "Is Mama going to be all right?" she asked, her small face pinched with worry. "Your Mama is the strongest woman I know," Ezekiel assured her, though his own anxiety was evident in the way he paced between tasks. "And Mrs. Thornton knows just what to do." As dawn broke on Christmas morning, a new cry joined the household, lusty and indignant at being thrust into the cold world. Ezekiel and Sarah sat up straight, eyes fixed on the bedroom door until Mrs. Thornton emerged, her face weary but smiling. "Congratulations, Mr. Carson," she announced. "You have a fine, healthy son." Ezekiel felt his knees weaken with relief and joy. A son. He and Elizabeth had a son. "Can we see them?" Sarah asked eagerly, already on her feet. Mrs. Thornton nodded. Your mama's asking for you both. They entered the bedroom to find Elizabeth propped up against the pillows, her face pale and exhausted but radiant with happiness. In her arms, wrapped in a blanket Elizabeth had spent months embroidering, lay a tiny red-faced infant with a surprising amount of dark hair. "Meet your son," Elizabeth said softly as Ezekiel approached the bed with reverent steps. William Ezekiel Carson. Emotion closed Ezekiel's throat as he gently touched his son's miniature fingers. The name was a gift he hadn't expected, honoring Elizabeth's first husband while linking the child to his new father. "He's perfect," he managed finally, leaning down to kiss Elizabeth's damp forehead. Sarah crowded close, her initial shyness giving way to fascination. "He's so small." "Was I that small, Mama?" "Just about," Elizabeth smiled. "Would you like to hold your brother?" With careful instruction, Sarah was settled in a chair with the baby supported in her arms. The look of wonder on her face as she gazed down at her new sibling brought fresh tears to Elizabeth's eyes. "I'm a big sister now," Sarah said with newfound importance. "I'm going to teach him everything." "I'm sure you will," Ezekiel agreed, his arm around Elizabeth's shoulders as they watched their children together. "You'll be the best big sister any boy could ask for." As the Christmas sun rose higher, bathing the room in golden light, Elizabeth looked around at the family that had formed so improbably from tragedy and chance. Her son, healthy and strong in his sister's careful embrace. Her daughter, blossoming in security and love. And her husband, whose strength and tenderness had rebuilt her world when she thought it shattered beyond repair. "Happy Christmas, Ezekiel," she whispered, reaching for his hand. He brought her fingers to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. "Happy Christmas, my love." Outside, fresh snow began to fall, covering the ranch in a clean white blanket that sparkled in the morning light. The barn where their story had begun stood sturdy against the winter, a silent reminder of how a single act of kindness could change the course of lives forever. Within the warm house, the Carson family welcomed their newest member, bound together not by blood alone, but by the deeper ties of love and choice the family they had built from the broken pieces life had given them, stronger at the mended places than it had ever been before. And in that moment, surrounded by the family that was both unexpected gift and hard-won treasure, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the hearts of those who loved her. From desperate widow sleeping in a stranger's barn to beloved wife, mother, and partner, her journey had come full circle. The roof under which they slept was more than mere shelter now. It was the canopy beneath which their love had grown and would continue to grow through all the seasons of their lives together.